Our next guest is Anaya, Chief Diversity Officer and Vice President of Global Inclusion at 3M. Prior to joining 3M, she was an Assistant United States Attorney for the Department of Justice. Anne, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yes, same with me. And just to get started, I'd love to hear about the diversity and inclusion efforts happening at 3M as we speak.
Yeah, well, as you know, 3M headquarters are right in St. Paul, Minneapolis. And so the epicenter of George Floyd's murder really reverberated throughout our community and our workforce. So we took a hard look at what we were doing to address all types of disparities, both inside our walls at 3M and around the globe, and in our communities. So we set out to do what we could do best to address those disparities. Inside 3M, we looked at the market availability for our workforce and identified that African Americans and Hispanic Latinos are underrepresented at 3M, and that we want to move to representation and then beyond so that our workforce looks like our communities and our customers.
Absolutely.
Beyond our walls and in our communities, we really look at, for example, the inequities in STEM occupations and education, and how 3M can move the needle toward more equitable outcomes with representation inside STEM education and careers in STEM.
Right. And I know that 3M, like you said, really had a front row seat to the epicenter of the U.S. racial reckoning that we experienced, and many communities experienced last summer. But we've seen a number of activists since then really call on corporate America to be held accountable, to make the changes you're talking about making at 3M. How should these corporations be held accountable, and what can employees, or maybe even minority employees in these communities, what can they do to make sure they're working for an equitable and safe organization?
Well, it's certainly much more than making commitments and writing checks. It's about making a difference. And, I've heard people mention just recently about measuring outcomes, equitable outcomes. So, for example, 3M committed to $50 million in our communities to address social justice. But much more than social justice, philanthropic and volunteer endeavors, we have the manpower, the skills, the hearts and souls of over 95,000 people around the globe that can infuse inclusion in all that they do in their communities. The other thing I would say that's really important that corporations can do is not forget the journey we're on for diversity and inclusion. Before this civil rights movement, before this pandemic, we were moving toward not only equity, but inclusion. And so there were many people feeling excluded from the efforts of diversity. Majority people that didn't fit into demographic categories that were being targeted by employee resource networks or affinity groups. So the idea of a broad tent of inclusion and making people invest intentionally in a culture of inclusion, whether it's throughout an organization or in society as a whole, we have to get away from the divisiveness in our society.
Right.
It definitely is. Yeah, it's not something where we can only focus on a singular group. We have to focus on privilege generally, marginalization generally, and this idea of inclusion to get everybody into the fold of change and behaviors that really push for equitable outcomes and an equal society.
Absolutely. And I want to go quickly to an audience question that we have from Daphne.
Hello, I'm Daphne Kwok, and I'm Vice President of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for the Asian American Pacific Islander audience at AARP. My question today is, what percentage of DE&I work should focus on belonging? Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great question because there is an equal measure of inclusion and belonging with measures of equity and diversity. So there is no one without the other. I would say they are inextricably intertwined. That if you have high representation without belonging and inclusion, that representation will not thrive, flourish, create, innovate. And so it is all for naught. So there has to be equal measures of both a commitment to diversity and a commitment to belonging and inclusion. The two together are so powerful. And it's the future of any organization. 3M has been around for 100 years, and without belonging with diversity and equity, we could never be around for another 100 years. It's the combination that really brings the magic.
You know, it's interesting, Anne. We live in a society that's highly politicized. And when we've seen a lot of the rhetoric surrounding race in this country, I think you have one side of the political aisle essentially saying, you know, this is the politics of a particular party. And I think corporations seem to have really been caught in the middle of trying to being socially aware and culturally aware, while at the same time trying to walk a fine line and being politically neutral. How should corporations tackle that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this idea of neutrality is interesting when you're talking about equity, because there should be no neutrality when it comes to what is equal. There should be no neutrality when it comes to what is inclusive. It is the right thing to do. It is the best thing to do for not only an organization, but also for society. So neutrality should be set aside for intention. And that is that each corporation, each individual has to decide at their core, what are we committed to and what are we going to do to make that come to pass? And if that means that we are working toward a society that benefits all in a way that creates an equal playing field for great participation as a citizen in society, but also as a contributor to any organization, that benefits all. So it shouldn't be neutral. It should be full speed ahead.
Definitely. And finally, you know as well as I do that the tone of a company and the goals of a company are set at the top, at the leadership level. How can leaders of companies and corporations be more inclusive?
Well, that's a fantastic question, because inclusive leadership should be how we define leadership. So the idea is that you're always seeking opportunity to offer support to champion, to expand, to really create an atmosphere that brings people in. So this idea of what does it mean to be a leader? An essential element of that needs to be an inclusive leader. And how do you know that you're doing that? You have to seek and ask for feedback, because being inclusive is a journey. It's a never-ending opportunity for improvement. We can always be better at how we are bringing about inclusion and looking to create belonging. So a spirit of growth mindset, a spirit of continuous learning, and then really active listening. How can I learn to be better at inclusion generally and inclusive leadership?
Absolutely. Well, Anaya, thank you so much for all of your time today. This is such an interesting and important discussion. I hope it continues outside of this forum. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.